fine. I'm full of cold as well. So again, it's my monthly cold that comes round. Am I lagging for anybody? I feel...
No, you were very late, but you're not lagging.
Lagging, but late but not lagging. Okay, good.
Well, I'm healthy, so that's notable, I guess, apparently in this context.
Well, good thing that we're leaving it in your capable hands.
The last one standing. I am the youngest. So I like to remind Jenny how much younger I am. So, welcome to the Bookcast Club, a podcast for people who like to chat books. Today, it's me, Sarah, coming to you from Lutruwita today, or Tasmania in Australia, and Jenny coming to you from Norwich in the UK. And we are really pleased to welcome back Shawn Mooney to the podcast. Hello, Shawn.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Shawn is from the YouTube channel Shawn the Book Maniac, and he reads and reviews a really large variety of books on there. He's been on the podcast a couple of times, so if you haven't heard his dulcet tones, is that an insult? If you haven't heard his voice before, let's say.
I'll take it. I will take it.
I'll put some of his past episodes in the show notes for you. So Shawn is joining us from Saskatchewan in Canada today. And actually, really interestingly, let's talk about what time it is actually. So it's 8 o'clock in the morning for me on Friday, the 10th of March. What time is it for you, Shawn?
It is 3 in the afternoon on Thursday.
And Jen? She doesn't know.
I'm going to get confused. I'm going to get confused now. It is 9 o'clock in the evening on the Thursday.
Thursday. There you go. So I think we're at sort of the only 2-hour slot, maybe, that all of us actually line up.
Yes.
Which is pretty crazy.
I'm pretty sure I've only been on your on your podcast once, haven't I?
Okay, sure. Possibly, yeah. I know I've recorded with you, like a couple of times. So
you've been on my show for about 3 times, but
I think it is one.
Okay. It was International Women's Day this week on the 8th of March, and around this time of year there are Longlists aplenty for people who like prizes, and particularly there are 3 literary prizes now that celebrate writing by women and non-binary writers. The Women's Prize in the UK, the Stella Prize in Australia, and for the first time this year, the Carol Shields Prize in Canada. So since we have here a Brit, an Australian, and a Canadian, we thought it would be fun to go through these 3 prizes for you guys today and discuss what we think of the long lists. But first, let's talk about what we've been currently reading. Do you want to start, Jen?
Right. Bear with me. I need to go and move the baby because he's taken to sleeping face down. I'm gonna go give this camera to Ben so that he can watch a face down mattress planting. Goes and make sure the baby can breathe. Bear with.
Okay, I'll start, shall I, while Jenny tries to not have her baby die. So I have just finished reading Happening by Annie Ernaux, which was actually given to me by a friend of mine who is actually appearing on the next episode, Belle. And Annie Ernaux, as I'm sure most people know, is a French writer who won the Nobel Prize last year, I believe, for fiction and non-fiction. And Happening is a really short piece of non-fiction. It's a memoir really. It's only about, I would say, less than 100 pages. So it is set, it's the recollection of what happened to her in the 60s when she was pregnant in France and trying to get an abortion. And I absolutely loved this. I read it in one sitting at the beach, actually. I could not put it down. It's really, really beautiful. It's really harrowing. I guess I knew that it was difficult to get an abortion, but I'd never thought about the actual logistics of what this would be like, where you have to try and ask different people. It doesn't happen immediately where you realize that you're pregnant, you decide you would like to get an abortion, and then you get it. It doesn't happen like that at all. She's pregnant for weeks while she tries to get this, and she sort of lives with it and she worries about it constantly while she's trying to get access to this healthcare that she essentially can't get. And you read it recently.
I did, and I just couldn't believe how powerful those very simple sentences were. It was so deceptively simple. And as I was reading it, as I was turning the pages, it just started to gather in its power, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since I put it down.
Yeah. It's
my first anything by Annie Ernaux, and it will definitely not be my last.
Yeah, it was also my first, actually. I mean, one of those authors, of course, that you are like, yes, must read stuff by her. and this was the first thing.
And the I can't remember if they were in parentheses, but there was several times where she would reflect on what she was writing from the point of now or from the point of when she was writing it, that added another vibration to the narrative that I just thought was really, really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Because she starts off by saying, essentially, this is something that happened to me a long time ago, and then the rawness of it is really surprising for that, because she only wrote it relatively recently, and it's just, yeah, I thought it was really, really excellent. I loved it. What are you reading, Jen?
I am reading briefly, A Delicious Life by Nell Stevens. I don't know, you probably have seen the cover. It's like one of those typical, very in right now covers with a woman on the front with a bit of fruit in her hand. But I'm really enjoying it. It's set in 1838, and we follow a woman called George who's living in a monastery in Mallorca with a man who you find out is her lover and her 2 children. And the book is narrated by a teenage ghost, and she's been haunting this monastery for 300 odd years, and she becomes more and more sort of obsessed with this family. And the blurb says she falls in love with George, but I haven't got that far yet, and I'm like 3/4 of the way through. But I'm really, really enjoying it. It's a very kind of slow burn historical fiction about a woman who's sort of breaking gender norms, and she dresses very masculine. She's left her husband, she's run away with another man and her children, and at the same time what could be really gimmicky in this sort of ghost narrator is actually so well done. I'm kind of in awe of her writing, really, because it's just feels really natural, and it doesn't feel like a gimmick at all, and we're slowly kind of learning why she's a ghost as well. I suspect it will be fully, revealed as the book goes on. But yeah, I'm really enjoying it, and I was initially drawn to it by the sultry fruit fondling on the front cover.
No surprise, a theme of yours.
I think this might be her first novel. She's written a bunch of kind of wacky literary memoirs.
Interesting. I knew it wasn't a debut, but I hadn't realised
I think it might be debut novel.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on her, but she's written like Bleaker House, Chasing My Novel to the End of the World, and Mrs. Gaskell and Me. Like, she writes memoirs about her relationship as a reader with various writers and stuff, which I've always been kind of vaguely interested in, but also don't tend to get along with those kind of books.
Oh,
usually.
Interesting. It's really good. I definitely wouldn't have thought it was a debut.
Yeah, it is such a trend though, isn't it? This like handwriting, the sexy fruit.
Yeah, sexy
so
fruit.
Did someone call me? No.
No. But what are you reading, Shawn, actually, speaking of?
Well, I'm reading way too many books at one time, but the one I chose, picked out of the stack to tell you, I'm going to hold it up here, but obviously nobody listening can see. It is a new novel by an Indigenous writer, Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. Very newly published, like about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago. Jessica Johns is a member of the Sucker Creek First Nation in what is now colonially referred to as Alberta. And and this is a Indigenous horror novel. I don't read horror novels. I'm very much of a literary fiction snob, but this one sounded so interesting that I just had to try it, and I'm so glad that I have. I'm only about a quarter of the way into it. The writing is lush. The protagonist is an Indigenous woman from Alberta living in Vancouver. Her sister died tragically about a year before, and she keeps having nightmares, but then comes back from the nightmare with something in her hand from the dream. So the opening scene is crow's feet, severed crow's feet in her hand. She wakes up in bed and she's got them dripping blood. So that sounds horrifying, But actually, it's not a scary book, at least not so far. It's really quite a layered narrative. I grant myself the authority to declare that it's not a horror novel, it's literary fiction. If I like it, it's literary fiction. It's really, really good. And also, the horror genre is the genre that makes the most sense for Indigenous writers in pretty much most places in the world because of the reality we settlers have impinged on them. So it's really starting out excellent. Love the writing.
Oh, that sounds really good.
I've heard of this one. I don't know
You have?
why. Well, I do know why. Yeah, because I've watched a lot of... I don't actually read a huge amount of horror, but I do watch a lot of YouTubers that talk about horror novels. So I must have seen somebody talk about this one.
Sure. I know it's been released in Canada and America the same day. I don't know where else it's been released, but...
Nice. Yeah, I want to read this. I think this sounds really good. It's interesting, this taking things out of dreams. I read this a couple of times in fantasy and a couple of other novels, so I wonder if this is something that those writers have taken from Indigenous culture or something.
Interesting. And, definitely, it's, like I say, it's not scaring me, but it is creepy because she wakes up and she walks down the street in Vancouver and the crows follow her.
Interesting, because I'm particularly thinking of the Raven Cycle, where one of the characters actually takes out crows from his nightmares a lot, and it's the same kind of theme. Obviously, this is like a young adult fantasy, so it's completely different, but yeah, he takes out, there's a raven that follows him around. That's what the name of the books come from, that he's actually taken out of his nightmare. So we talk about the 3 prizes. Do we want to do a little bit of an intro? What do you think, Jen, to the prizes, or shall we just get into them? Do we think people are sort of au fait with the idea of them?
I've got a very short intro to the Women's Prize.
Okay.
Just in case it's the first episode people have listened to about them. I doubt it.
Okay. Yeah, good one. All right, so let's start talking about the prizes, and let's start with the Women's Prize.
I'm sure everybody has heard plenty about the Women's Prize. If they're anywhere near social media or on YouTube, it's everywhere at the moment. So the Women's Prize was announced on Wednesday, the 7th, which was International Women's Day. And the prize was founded in 1991 in a sort of protest to the all-male Booker nominee lineup that came out that year. Entrants, obviously from women, but they can be writing in English about any subject in any genre. Their books just have to have been published after the 1st of April, the year the award calls for entries, to the September, I think, of the year that the award is announced. So it will have been for books published from the 1st of April 2022 up until this coming September. The 16 nominees were announced on Wednesday. I have heard of a grand total of 7 of them. I was sure this year I was going to already have read some of the long list. I was very positive. I read quite a few sort of new releases last year that felt very Women's Prize. No, there are none of them on there. So I've got my work cut out if we're going to do an episode on the Women's Prize later in the year. I'm going to just read out the nominees quickly. I'm not going to go through all of them because the 16 will be here all night, but I'll just read them out. So we've got Glory by Navila Bulawayo, Homesick by Jennifer Croft, Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks, Children of Paradise by Camilla Gradova, Stoneblind by Natalie Haynes, Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kinsolver, Cursed Bread by Sophie McIntosh, The Dog of the North by Elizabeth Mackenzie, Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris, The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell, I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel, Pod by Laineen Paul, Wandering Souls by Cecile Pinn, The Bandit Queens by Perini Schroff, and Memphis by Tara M. Stringfellow. So the ones I'd heard of are Stoneblind by Natalie Haynes, which I'm assuming is the mythological retelling that's on the long list this year. Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, which I believe is a sort of Island Troubles based book. Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, which is a retelling of David Copperfield, I think.
Yeah, I think it's like based on David Copperfield. A reimagination of it.
A reimagination, that's the one. Curse Bread by Sophie McIntosh. And The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. So generally, just the biggies are the ones that I'd heard of. And apparently over half of them are debut novels. Yeah, I don't know what you two have made of the long list. I'll talk about a few of the ones that I really like the sound of. But I was wondering how much of the long list you were aware of.
I was aware of maybe a quarter of the books, something like that. I just started reading Trespasses this week, so that was good timing. Irish readathon and all. Of course, Demon Copperhead, everybody's talking about that one.
What about you, Sarah?
Great question. I'm just looking at the long list again, trying to... Yeah, I'm sort of the same, maybe a third of them. I'd heard a lot of the authors, like Sophie McIntosh. I've read The Water Cure by her, which I really liked, actually. But I hadn't heard of her new book. Natalie Haynes I'd heard of course. And then Trespassers and the Demon Copperhead are the two major ones that I was familiar with. And the rest... so about the same as you, The Marriage Portrait, of course. Oh, and I have read Glory, of course, because that was long-listed for the Booker, shortlisted, I think.
It was a really unique way to find out that one of my favorite writers has a new novel out, was to hear it on the long list. Like, I've been checking, when is this author going to come up with a new book? And I thought I just checked a few weeks ago, but obviously I didn't check in the right place. So Elizabeth Mackenzie, whatever that book is, the something Fox, is on the long list. And I loved her last novel, The Portable Veblen, and I've read an earlier novel of hers, or maybe linked short stories that I also really, really liked. And I've been waiting, and there it is on the long list, so I was delighted.
The Dog of the North, it's called.
Oh, not Fox, sorry.
Dog Fox. Yeah, The Dog of the North. It's interesting because this is terrible and just shows, doesn't it? But I kind of had dismissed that because I've never heard of Elizabeth Mackenzie, and I'm assuming this is the UK cover. Not very appealing.
Yeah, the cover maybe isn't the greatest, although I think it has a certain charm. But just based on how smart and funny The Portable Veblen was, it was also one of the most incredible audiobooks I've ever experienced. The audiobook of The Portable Veblen. So I'm hoping this one has a good audiobook as well. It gets released just next week, I think.
There was a squirrel on the front, wasn't there?
There's a squirrel in the book. A talking squirrel. I mean, talking squirrel language.
Foxes, squirrels, dogs.
I remember that book cover now. And it's funny, isn't it, how they can completely change the vibe or the feel of an author based on the cover that they put out. Because I would never have put those two covers together based on the one that's just for listeners' benefit. It's like a little cartoony, maybe even like a watercolour painting of a camper van. And it just looks a little bit like you'd find it in the romance section.
I think to me it looks like the sort of thing you'd find in a little free library. It's a criminally bad cover, in my opinion. I absolutely hate it. I think some of these covers are absolutely atrocious. I don't know. It really does them a disservice. I absolutely hate it, these poor authors.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that, Shawn, because now I'm more intrigued to pick that one up. But I'll just talk about the ones that I have immediately gone and reserved at the library, which inevitably means they won't make it onto the shortlist, and I'll just make my job even harder trying to read that shortlist. So the ones that I have highlighted, actually one of them I own, so I was almost close to having read one, and that was Children of Paradise by Camilla Grudova. So the reason that I'd spotted this one previously is because it's a book set in a cinema. So this woman, I think the main protagonist, goes and gets a job in like quite a rundown cinema, a musky sort of old cinema that all the staff have been there ages. And the reason that appealed to me is one, that I love film and cinema anyway, but it really reminded me of the cinema I used to go to as a child. So I used to go to the Lyric in Carmarthen. If anybody in Wales, in Carmarthen, has heard of it, they'll know what I'm talking about. But it was this theatre, this really sort of run-down, dusty old theatre that they would show films in, and they actually made a film about it called, I think it's called Save Our Cinema, that the guy that played Malfoy in Harry Potter was in, and they actually filmed it at the cinema, which I found really weird because I used to go there as a teenager, and it sounded like, it just reminded me of that cinema, but it sounds like this girl goes and gets a job at this cinema, and the staff that are already there are quite cliquey and close-knit, and she's desperately trying to get in with them, and then when she does, I think the blurb says something about her becoming part of the paradise, which is what the cinema is called, and that it takes on some sort of sinister tone. So all in all, that just sounds like a book that I'd really, really enjoy. And it's a short one, I think it's like 200 pages. Go on, Shawn.
Even though you didn't think it was important enough to mention, I'm certainly going to barge in here and say she's a Canadian writer.
Oh, is she? I hadn't realised. I had, hold on, in my notes, I had... Oh, here you go. So, apparently the long list is made up of 7 British authors, 5 Americans, 1 Irish, 1 Canadian, and 1 Zimbabwean American, and 1 French author. So there you go, that's the Canadian author. I had not realised that. The others I like the sound of are Cursed Bread by Sophie McIntosh. I think this one again sounds like some sort of obsessive longing by the protagonist. So she becomes obsessed with a couple that move to the town that she lives in, and again sinister things start happening. So I don't know whether this is a theme of the Women's Prize long list, but I did really like the sound of that one. I've not read The Water Cure. Sarah, would I have enjoyed that if I'd read it, do you think?
Yes, you would, I think. It's quite quiet, it's quite slow, it's got a like kind of sinister undertone that you really enjoy.
Okay.
It's been quite a few since I read it, so I don't remember the plot specifically, but they're trying to go into the water to get a cure for something, and then more of them are going in, I think, and staying in for longer, and so it's got that sort of really unsettling vibe that you seem to really thrive on.
I do. That is true. Another one that I like the sound of is Black Butterflies by Priscilla Morris. So this one's historical. Well, yeah, no, it's a historical event. So set in Sarajevo in spring 1992. The blurb says, each night nationalist gangs erect barricades, splitting the diverse city into ethnic enclaves. Each morning the residents, whether Muslim, Croat or Serb, push the makeshift barriers aside. And yeah, it seems like we follow... it's historical fiction, so we follow one of the residents of the town. And when the violence spills over, she sends her husband, her mother and her daughter to England, and she stays behind and sort of rebuilds their life. So yeah, that one just sounded really interesting to me, historical fiction wise. Then Memphis by Tara M. Stringfellow, I really like the sound of. I don't know whether this might be doing a disservice to the book, but I don't know whether it's because I went to see the film Elvis, which obviously is set in Memphis and Beale Street. So if it captures the kind of, I don't know, the vibe and stuff of that area, I think I'll really enjoy that. Sounds like a very vibrant place. So that one I really like the sound of. And finally, which I got a feeling Sarah might want to talk about, is Pod by Laline Paul. Now, I didn't read The Bees. I definitely owned it, but I don't seem to have it anymore. I feel like I have lent that to someone and it has never returned. But The Bees, was that written from a bee's perspective?
I assume so, but just an assumption.
Sarah, do you know?
I think so. I haven't read. I just think Pod sounds really interesting. I've already got it on hold. I have to say, another criminal cover. I absolutely hate this cover. It looks so much like a movie poster. It's ridiculous.
Right.
It
so the
looks
thing
awful.
I was going to say is that, one, I think this is the climate change book of this year's list. I can't remember what the one last year is called, but there was one last year that was very climate change based. The cover of this book looks like the movie poster of the film The Cove, if you've ever seen it. So for anyone that's wondering why we're talking about this book so much, I get the impression it's about dolphins, and it's going to be narrated from a dolphin's perspective, which is why I was asking if the bees was narrated from a bee's perspective. But The Cove, which is what this cover really looks like, is about the Japanese. There's a Japanese port that would lure the dolphins in and murder them and capture them, and places like SeaWorld would go and pick the dolphins that they want. So it's like a very criminal practice that was going on. And the film undercovers. The crew in the film go undercover to kind of expose what was happening in this cove, which is very secretive. It looks exactly the same as the cover of this book. So I'm intrigued to see where this one goes. It's probably not related in the slightest, but we'll see.
I've got this on hold at the library already. I'm very excited about this. Yeah, I don't know if I'm being too judgmental or something, but it seems way too experimental for the Women's Prize. I was very surprised to see it on here, so I'm very intrigued by it.
I did, when I heard about it from Eric Carl Anderson's reaction video, I thought, one of these things is not like the other. Yeah, it was the one that kind of stood out. Jen, are you into animal narrators, animal characters in fiction?
I don't know if I've read an awful lot. I feel like I've really read Animal Farm. That might be it.
Okay. Well, there's one on my list, so if you're still here, I'll make sure to tell you about it.
Okay.
I'm not at all. I am not at all. But
okay. It's one of those things I can imagine if it's not done well, it's not going to work.
I'll say also that Gloria's also has animal narrators, but I was equally surprised to see Gloria on the long. I knew there would probably be some Booker overlap because there always is.
I was going to say that's the only one, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's funny. The Women's Prize is so, I don't know how this happens because they have a different panel every year, but there's just so many points that they hit like every year. They've got the retelling. They didn't really have a Greek retelling last year, but yeah, they've got Greek retellings. They've always got historical fiction. They've always got something like one book overlapping with the Booker long list. It's really odd.
Like they have a checklist.
Yeah, it seems like they do because there's just so many categories that they hit just like year after year, which seems to me utterly bizarre. But I'm interested to see what happens with Gloria because I'm not sure what other people will make of it, but I'm glad more people are going to read it because I really, really liked it. And I will put a link in the show notes to the episode where we talked about all the Booker books and we talk about Gloria in more detail, but it's essentially it's set in a fictional African country, and it's sort of a metaphor for Mugabe's takeover, and it's about how the people of this country, who are all animals in the context of this story, sort of deal with the living with a dictator and how that is. I'm currently reading The Marriage Portrait, actually, which is the Maggie O'Farrell.
Oh.
I don't know. So this is my third Maggie O'Farrell. So I've read Hamnet, and I've read her memoir, I Am, which I loved. I wasn't a huge fan of Hamnet, and I like the stories that she writes, but I find her writing to be so bloated. I find it quite frustrating. So she just has I feel like it just sort of drowns in adjectives, and I know people really like it, and most people seem to be huge Maggie O'Farrell fans. But I always feel that like I'm just sort of wading through syrup or something, like looking for the story, just underneath all these like delicious adjectives, which I don't know. So I'm not into her writing at all. Maybe I know that's just me because everyone on the planet, apart from Chris, maybe, seems to love it. But I find them to be way too heavy in description.
I loved I Am. I listened to Hamnet, so I don't know whether that made a difference, and I DNF'd the Heatwave one. So it might not just be you, Sarah, and I know Chris doesn't like her, so...
I started with a much earlier novel of hers, The Vanishing Act of Esme Lennox, which I loved, and I wonder if her writing has changed, or maybe I just didn't notice all those syrupy adjectives.
Maybe you're just a more generous person than me. I know Chris hated Esme Lennox and Hamnet.
Everything I heard about Hamnet, I thought I don't even need to bother with it. It just sounds too sentimental or something.
Yeah, I found it not sad enough. Actually, that was my complaint about it. I thought it was not. I don't know. We actually talked about it. This is a bit of the grief episode.
I remember you talking about that on an episode. That's right. Yeah. But there's something about the marriage portrait that does attract me.
Yeah, so it's an interesting story. It's just, yeah, bloated is the word that I would use. Obviously, that's going to be a personal taste thing. Some people are not going to care about that at all. I find it annoying, but I know she's almost wholly loved, so whatever. He'll probably win.
The baby's awake, but I'll be here listening, I think, because he probably just needs feeding and go back to bed.
Okay, so while Jenny does that, I hope you're enjoying the episode, and I'm going to have a little brief interlude now where I tell you about the ways that you can support the podcast, some of which are totally free. So a really effective and free way of showing your support to us is by rating and reviewing us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also share our posts on social media or engage with us on social media. We are at Bookcast Club on both Instagram and Twitter, and we absolutely love seeing your comments and reading what you have to say in our DMs. So please hit us up or share what we're saying. If you enjoy the pod, we really appreciate it. If you would like to support the podcast financially, we also have a Patreon account. On our Patreon, we offer early access to the podcast, monthly bonus episodes, and also personalized book recommendations and books in the post. If you don't want to do a monthly donation, we also have a coffee, which is a way that you can just make one-off contributions to us if you would prefer. The link for that is in the show notes, as are all of the books and all the other things that we discussed today. But however you choose to support us, we want you to know we really, really appreciate it. It really makes our day to read your comments. And thank you very much for listening. So that was the Women's Prize, and now we're going to keep going with the Carol Shields and then the Stella. So let's go to Carol Shields for now. Shawn, would you like to kick us off?
Absolutely. So the Carol Shields Prize for Fiction, this is its inaugural year, and it is named after the American-Canadian writer Carol Shields, and she died really quite young in 2003 of cancer, and it was just like a literary tragedy because she was just kind of at the height of her powers, and she was gone. She was one of my favorite writers when I was younger, and I met her a couple times at readings and stuff. We were not friends, but I did get all my books signed by her, and she was just a lovely person. And so friends of hers in the literary world decided to name this prize after her. And this is a prize, the first thing to say about it is, I think it's the most lucrative prize in the Western world for literary prizes. It certainly dwarfs the Women's Prize. And it is a prize for fiction by women, which of course includes trans women, as if that even needs to be said, but women and non-binary writers who live in North America and who are published in North America over the past year. I looked up and I did some conversion. It's a little bit US-centric because I converted everything to US dollars, but it's $150,000 US. No, that's not right. It's $110,000 US, the prize, which is about $110,000 US. And if you compare that, I'm just going to give these and converted to US dollars. The Women's Prize is $36,000. The Booker is $60,000. The International, same, $60,000. There's the Dublin Prize, whatever it's called, is pretty close. It's $106,000 US. And there is the only one that I could find that was more of a golden pot was the Sheikh Zayed Book Award in the UAE, and it was about $200,000. But they've endowed it luxuriously to make a statement about the fact that women do get nominated for a bunch of other awards, but they rarely win. And so let's go do this with a big splash.
Yeah, wow. The difference between the Women's Prize, award, I do think that they should be given more, considering how big that prize is.
That's right.
You just thought they could up the winnings on that one a tad.
I love that they've done that in such a strong statement. Like, we are going to support it, and we're going to put a large amount of money behind it. It's really cool. Love that.
I think they've already fundraised like $1 million, and are actively fundraising, and they got a 6-figure donation from, oh dear, I can't remember if it was Bill Gates' wife. Yeah, it was Bill Gates' wife. Donated a lot of money to it.
Well, Melinda Gates is a big reader, so that would make sense, I would say.
And yes, so non-binary writers as well. Has a fantastic jury for its inaugural year, including at least one of my favorite writers. That is the Métis writer who lives in what we now call Canada, Katharina Vermette, who is one of my very most favorite writers. She is on the jury, and lots of other big names within North American women's literature. I'm really excited about the prize. I'm not much of a literary prize follower, but this one I'm going to, at least for the first year, be a bit of a groupie. So I will go through very briefly the long list. There's 15 titles here. Brown Girls by Daphne Palasi Andreadis. When We Were Sisters by Fatima Asghar. Natural History Stories by Andrea Barrett. Activities of Daily Living by Lisa Xiao Chen. God Isn't Here Today by Francine Cunningham. Woman of Light by Callie Fajardo-Anstein. Let There Be Light by Leanna Fink. We Should Not Be Afraid of the Sky by Emma Hooper. Thank You, Mr. Nixon by Gish Jen. Junie by Shalene Knight. And this is the one I wanted to make sure Jen heard about. What We Fed to the Manticore by Talia Lakshmi Koluri. We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies by Sering Yangzom Lama. The Sleeping Car Porter by Suzette Mayer. Elsewhere by Alexis Shaitkin. And The Furrows by Nawali Serpell. So those are the 15. So Jen, while you're here, because I know you may not always be here, or you may be disappearing anytime soon, What We Fed to the Manticore is, let me see, is a collection of short fiction, all of which have an animal narrator. I think different animals for narrating each story. So knock yourself out if that interests you. It doesn't interest me at all, but
if I get into the animal narrator, then that sounds good.
I can see this easily becoming a fetish/fixation of yours, Jen, easily.
Dark, weird animal narration.
The ones that are of particular interest to me. I'll start with the one I'm currently reading, which is, The Sleeping Car Porter by Suzette Mayer. Suzette Mayer is a queer black author from Calgary, Alberta, and this novel won the Scotia Giller Award last year and was nominated for the Republic of Consciousness Prize. And based on, I think I'm about halfway through, I think it might become my favorite Canadian novel of all time ever. Like, it's just so good. It's about a gay male black porter on the train in about 1929 or something. I forget the year, but historical, set back in history. And he is the life of a train porter. I had no idea. I mean, maybe things got better closer to the modern day, but certainly back then they were basically just this side of being enslaved by the work, and were all constant. They were in constant danger of getting fired for the slightest offense. Never any time to sleep, hardly any food, and just the way the passengers treated them. And they were always black. And the protagonist is working the job to save money to be a dentist, to go to dental college. And he's on his last ride, and he's only got something like 10 demerit points left. If he gets 10 more demerit points, if he gets 10 more demerit points, he'll be fired, and he won't be able to go to dental school. So those are the stakes of the novel. It's just lush, gorgeous writing, fabulously literary, and based on the fact that it's the only one I've read part of, I hope it wins.
Nice, that sounds interesting. Very unique kind of story.
It is. And, his job is do this, do that, do this, and there's no variation. So I thought, this is going to be so boring after a while, because he's just doing the same things. But no, she gives him a really rich inner life, and it builds on the repetitiveness of his tasks, just builds in intensity, so that it's just, wow. I am also interested in one of the Indigenous titles here, because it's by a Indigenous writer from Western Canada that I've never heard of. And that is the short story collection God Isn't Here Today, which I think is a fabulous title, by Francine Cunningham, who describes herself as an Indigenous writer, artist, and educator. these short stories also have elements of horror and dark stuff going on. So that's what kind of has given me this half-baked theory that the idiom of the horror genre really resonates with Indigenous stories. So that one, I already have the ebook borrowed from the library. Can't wait to get to it. I was so nervous waiting for the long list to be announced that I was going to be, because I've got this interview set up with the CEO of the Carol Shields Prize tomorrow. The interview was supposed to be a week ago, and I was planning to get the interview up to generate some enthusiasm for the long list, but that they couldn't make that schedule. So it's tomorrow. And I was kind of nervous that I might be really unhappy or disappointed or politically offended by the long list, and then I would cancel the interview in a huff. But I'm really pleased with the diversity, the cultural diversity and gender diversity and everything. They've hit all the right notes for me. And when you take a look at who the jurors are, that makes perfect sense. So the non-binary book on the list is When We Were Sisters by Fatima Asghar. Fatima Asghar is I believe, American writer. I'm pretty sure American writer of South Asian descent. And they immigrated to the U.S. with their parents, and then their parents died in the same year, so I don't know what that was about. But it seems that is the premise of this novel. 3 sisters, and that is the word in the description, sisters, who were orphaned, and how they raise each other. Part of the story, an important part of the story of one of those 3 sisters is a journey with gender identity. So it sounds like a really autobiographical novel. This is their first work of fiction. They have also co-edited an anthology of Muslim people who are women, trans, gender nonconforming, and or queer, and the title is lovely. The title is Halal If You Hear Me. So that one I'm really interested in. Emma Hooper is a writer that I'm curious about. Emma Hooper was born in Alberta. She lives now in the UK. And every book, I haven't read any of her stuff, but every book she's written is completely different from the other. Her debut novel, Etta and Otto and Russell and James, a large part of that story takes place in Saskatchewan. So that kind of makes sense. Although why somebody from Alberta would want to write about Saskatchewan, because Saskatchewan's kind of the ugly sister compared to Alberta. That's what Alberta people think. I haven't read that. Then her next novel, Our Homesick Songs, set in Newfoundland. And this one is set in ancient Rome. We Should Not Be Afraid of the Sky. She's also a musician, has performed with Peter Gabriel and a string quartet. The other one I have on my shelf that I haven't read is by the Tibetan-Canadian writer, or maybe Tibetan-American writer. She has lived in both America and Canada. This book was on the Giller long list last year, I'm pretty sure. Sering Yangzom Lama, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies. I am really interested in Tibetan stories. I haven't read very many, but I am... from a purely political point of view, nothing to do with the good people that live there, but the politics of China. I don't like the way certain lefty types make apologies for how evil China is to its own people, including especially the Tibetans. So this is a story that I very much want to read. And maybe that's enough. But yeah, there's a lot of good, interesting stuff on here.
A lot of those sound really good, actually. I've been looking them up as you've been describing them. They sound really in my own library. There's
also a graphic novel, and I am a bit of an old school genre policer, so I don't think graphic stuff should be on a literary prize list. Not at all. But who cares about my old stodgy opinions? But anyway, it does look interesting. It is a retelling of the Book of Genesis from a female feminist point of view, so that part sounds pretty interesting. That's Let There Be Light by Liana Fink.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, graphic novels are also eligible for the Stella, I believe. It's interesting. And then Women's Prize, I think, definitely not, because they have a minimum word count.
I was incensed, just shocked when there was a graphic novel on the Booker that year. Remember that?
Yeah, I didn't mind.
My high dudgeon about it is just, like, who cares, right? Doesn't matter. But what I argued with friends about it, said, well, don't the graphic book community, don't they have their own prizes? Yes, they do. Do they allow literary fiction novels by Margaret Atwood or whatever on their prize list? No. Well, then why would we allow them on ours? I don't get it.
I didn't mind it at all because I normally read almost all the Booker books. So I was like, great, that's less reading for me.
I'm betraying my age here.
Well, that might be a good time actually to switch over to the Stella. So the Stella is an Australian literary prize for women and non-binary writers who must be either Australian citizens or living in Australia. And it even says on their website, I think, with permanent residency. So they're quite specific they're much more specific about the actual author's, I don't know, residency status than anything else. But they can be published, their books can be published anywhere in the world, and it's for the calendar year. So the books that are longlisted for this year were published in 2022. And they accept, I was just looking at all the books that they accept, so they have all novels of all genres, memoirs, biographies, they have all non-fictions, they have novels in verse, so poetry, they have graphic novels, they allow translated fiction even, so they have literally everything. They have short story collections, and they actually longlist. I follow the longlist pretty closely, and they will longlist all of this kind of stuff. So they will have poetry on there, they will have graphic novels. I don't think I've seen a translated novel on the long list, but they certainly have novellas, and they have all sorts of stuff on there. And you would think that such a general category would be quite discordant, but I've read quite a lot of the long list and short list over the past couple of years, and I find it to be not discordant at all. I don't know if they do this intentionally, but they seem to have a kind of theme, and they'll look at books that are exploring the same kind of theme in completely different ways. So it's a very interesting way to do a prize, but I think it's really good, and for them it really works. So I don't think necessarily it should be adopted by everyone, but for Stella it certainly works. Okay, so this year I watched the long list announcement, which was really, really interesting, and they described a little bit how they actually go through the process of choosing the books, which I always find super interesting. And the judges specifically said that they get given the books with no information about the publisher. They don't get the covers at all. They get these special editions that have no graphics on them, unless it's specifically a graphic novel, and they know the author, I think, but they certainly don't know the publisher, and they try and make it as blind as possible. And notably, the vast majority of these books on the long list this year are from very, very small indie presses, and they actually made the point that they didn't know hardly any of the books that they were given to read, and they made a big point of pointing out the lack of big publishers in the long list this year, which I thought was a really interesting point. So they have 12 books on the long list. The Stella Prize is quite a tight turnaround. So the long list is announced on the 2nd of March, was announced on the 2nd of March. The short list will be announced on the 30th of March already, and then the winner is already at the end of April. So it's quite short compared to other prizes, but I will read out the long list this year. So it's The Furies by Mandy Beaumont, Every Version of You by Grace Chan, We Come With This Place by Deborah Dank, The Big Beautiful Female Theory by Eloise Grills, The Jaguar by Sarah Holland Batt, Hydra by Adrian Howell, Jack of Hearts by Inger Jarrow and Jackie Huggins, All That's Left Unsaid by Tracy Lien, Indelible City by Louisa Lim, Iris by Fiona Kelly McGregor, Decadence by Twee On, and Bad Art Mother by Edwina Preston.
To me, I can't understand how you can judge a work of poetry against a work of nonfiction and vice versa. I just don't know how that would work. But again, doesn't matter. There's a lot of these books, except the poetry, that look really interesting to me.
Yeah, it's funny. I would have thought I mean, I do think the same, actually, and I would hate to be a judge. But over the long list and short list that I've read of this prize, it genuinely really does work. Like, I think it's the theme where you're like, oh, they really are looking at a similar concept. I remember one year, the year that See What You Made Me Do by Jess Hill won, they were looking at a structural oppression of women a lot. There seems to be a lot of the books were about societal structures that keep women oppressed. It was just so interesting to see this kind of constant theme expressed in different ways. So in terms of sharing ideas, I guess, which is the point of a prize, I think it's really cool. I absolutely would hate to judge it though, but that's their thing. But I think it's quite cool that there's a prize like that does, it's quite different and unique that it does that. So hats off to them, I say. So I thought I'd go through. Unfortunately, one thing with the Stella is that these are Australian novels, which means they are notoriously difficult to get if you live outside of Australia. So because of that, what I've done is I basically looked through the list and I looked at the ones that would be possible for me to get in the Netherlands. And so those are the ones that I've sort of chosen 4 or 5 of those to talk about in more detail, so that I'm not boring you with books that you actually can't possibly buy if you wanted to. So the first one I wanted to talk about was The Furies by Mandy Beaumont, which I have to be honest, I'd seen before, and I had seen the blurb, and it looked super... I thought the blurb was really boring. It's a story of someone whose mother is taken away by the police, then her father leaves 3 months later, and now she's in search of her sister. Maybe just me. I didn't think that was a super interesting kind of plot. But then the way the judges described it was completely different, and completely different from what the publisher had said. So they said that this is actually a look at... The Furies is actually referring to female anger and devastation. And they said that the author is casting an unflinching look at how patriarchy manifests in poverty, particularly in an era of postpartum depression and in an era when psychosis wasn't a medical condition, but a personal character flaw. And when I heard them talking about it, I was like, what? Because the blurb sounds just like, I don't know, it doesn't talk about any of this. So now I'm actually intrigued by this. Yeah, powerful meditation on gendered, inherited and historical trauma. So it sounds excellent. These damn publishers. The next one is We Come With This Place by Deborah Dank. So Deborah Dank is an Indigenous writer, and this is kind of a memoir of almost vignettes of her life, and very poetic, and you just get dropped in at different moments of her life. I'm reading this one at the moment. I'm about halfway through, and this one I'm really enjoying. And I thought I'd just read a little bit to you guys. A bit that I thought was particularly good. So she went in a bit where she's talking about her school growing up in the 60s and 70s in Queensland, which is in the northeast of Australia. And she's talking about what it was like for her as an Indigenous person being in school. She says, I sat in the classrooms of schools in Queensland in the 60s and 70s and have stood in front of them and in other places of Western learning since the 80s, but our soul-deep stories are rarely located in these establishments. It is mainly other stories that occupy those bookshelves, told in voices that have grown in other places, voices that are new to this place and are yet to learn this country. Our stories are mostly not there. They are located somewhere that is silent and hidden, in memory that is not often visited. Some of these new voices try to tell our story, but their souls do not speak the language of this place, and their ears are yet to learn to hear its stories.
Wow. That's powerful.
Yeah, I'm really, really enjoying it. It's really excellent. Okay, the next one that is available is poetry, Shawn, called The Jaguar by Sarah Holland Barrett. So she's an Australian poet who has written quite a few books of poetry, and this is a story of this is telling a story of someone whose father has Parkinson's disease, and it's about the progression of this disease and the sort of grieving that you get in the lead up to someone dying from a disease. And the judges really praise this highly, and they specifically emphasize that this is a book for non-poetry readers.
Okay.
Yeah, they said this. One of the judges specifically said, if you're scared of poetry, please read this book because you can do it. He was quite funny. And they were talking about how she's specifically looking at the breakdown of a body and how the body can be a site of pleasure and pain and frailty and energy, I guess. And she's writing about sex, romance and aging in different stages of your life. And they said it was a really excellent. So I've also got that one on hold.
I will vow to try it if I can get access to it. How's that?
It's only poetry, Shawn. You can get through it quickly. You'll be okay. But you don't have to read it. It's fine.
Oh, I do occasionally read poetry and have good experiences, but no, that's not really my jam.
Okay, well, this judge, he was very emphatic. He was looking at the crowd and he was holding it up and he said, you can read this book. It was pretty funny. And the last one that there's two more. So one of the last ones is Indelible City by Louisa Lim. So Louisa Lim is a journalist. I think she's Chinese-English, actually. And she's written quite a lot of stuff before, and she's actually been shortlisted for the Orwell Prize for political writing. And Indelible City is her newest non-fiction, and it's actually about Hong Kong. And she started writing it in 2019, I think, during all the protests that were happening in Hong Kong. And she says the story of Hong Kong has been obscured by competing myths, from the barren rock, according to Britain, to what China says about it being a part of Chinese soil, to its inhabitants. Its city is a place of refuge and rebellion, whose own history has been so little taught that they've begun myth-making their own past. And so in this, she's covering critical moments in Hong Kong's history. So she's talking about the British takeover in 1842, and then what happened in 1997 when there were negotiations about it being returned to China, and now what's kind of happening with Beijing and the direction that Hong Kong is going in now. And so she mixes this kind of factual non-fiction with more personal things that happen on the ground. So she goes there and she talks to protesters, and she conveys more personal stories about what it actually means to them and what this sort of odd country that flips back and forth, what it actually means to live there and how they actually think of it, and what people who actually live in Hong Kong think of this sort of identity.
It sounds incredible. I didn't realize the author was Australian, but it's been on my radar for a while, and I absolutely need to read it.
Yeah, she lives in Melbourne, I think, and it sounds really good. And the judges said she also looks at media coverage and what it means to cover a story from both sides. And that one I've also got on hold for the library. I've got the whole long list on hold. I don't know why I'm making this point, but it sounds excellent.
I just checked about the Jaguar. It's available to me in Canada on Audible for $12, so I'm going to get to it sooner rather than later.
Wow. I'm very surprised and impressed, Shawn. If you even tried, I'll be really happy.
I will do it to make you happy because it's one of my main purposes for existence. Okay,
well, there you go. Very easy to do. Set you back a mere $12. And the last one that is available is Hydra. Oh, it's not the last one that's available, but it's the last one that is A, available, and B, I decided to talk about, which is Hydra by Adrian Howell, which I put on there just for you, Jen, because it's about a woman who buys a derelict beachside cottage that used to be a naval base, I believe. And I think it's still owned by the army, and they're offering a 100-year lease on this weird, rambly old cottage. And they're like, if you go and live there, it's super cheap, and please fix up our cottage. And so she goes there, and it's full of antiques, and apparently it's got a really nice description of Queen Anne furniture, which is a very odd thing to put in a review, but that's what one of the judges said. And so she's in this cottage, and then it turns out that there is a ghost, or it's haunted or something, and so then it starts to get all dark.
I was going to say, is this place haunted?
Yep.
Yes.
And I was like, this overlap of Queen Anne furniture, a beachside cottage, and a weird vengeful ghost is exactly like this is Jen.
Yep.
So those are the ones that are sort of more available to people that I think sound really interesting on the long list this year.
If I might, I'd like to comment on two others that I just had a quick look at this a couple hours ago. Oh, I didn't look at it closely enough. It's actually a graphic memoir. It's a memoir and essays, but in graphic form. I didn't notice that. Okay. Big Beautiful Female Theory by Eloise Grills. And I'm still interested. The graphic thing has thrown me off a little bit. The graphic has thrown me off a little bit. But memoir and essays, that is a genre that really works for me. So I'm interested in trying that. And then I fell in love with the author when I read her bio, because her poetry collection from 2020 or something, here's its title: If You're Sexy and You Know It, Slap Your Hams. I just, instant love. And then a little bit more seriously, there's a queer novel. Is it a novel? Yeah, queer historical fiction. Fiona Kelly McGregor, Iris, exploring class marginalization and queer identity in the Depression-era slums of Australia. That one sounds pretty darned interesting.
Yeah, that one I was going to put on this list, but I found it's not possible to buy it in the Netherlands, so I didn't look elsewhere. But yeah, that one sounds really interesting, because I think that's about a woman who migrates, I think, from England and to Australia during the Depression. And then it says she meets a sex worker, called Maisie, so I assume it becomes like a romance. That seems to be what they're saying without actually saying it, but that sounds really interesting. And I realised when they were describing it, I don't think I've ever read an Australian novel set in that era. I've read plenty of stuff set in the US and the UK, but not Australia. I actually have Big Beautiful Female Theory here, Shawn, so I can show you. I got it from the library. Can you see?
So
I just thought I'd have a look to see, okay, this is not a graphic novel. I'm just flicking through it. It's an illustrated.
Oh, it's illustrated, but it's not totally. Oh, okay, that I feel much more interested in it again.
Much more comfortable.
It looks almost like a picture book. So it's for the listener. So it's got large swathes of text, but then it's got a lot of. It's like a picture book. Large. It's one of those long form picture books that you get when you're a very good reader, when you're about 10 years old. But it's for adults. But I do find it funny that you were insulting graphic novels and poetry, and then the first two things that you mentioned for the long list were a graphic novel and poetry. That did not escape my notice.
What did Walt Whitman say? Do I contradict myself? Do I contradict myself? I contain multitudes.
This looks great.
It does. If you don't mind stealing that, you could send it to me in the mail, that library book.
No, I'm fearful of my library.
I was going to ask you too, is the Carol Shields and the Stella, are they quite explicit in their support of trans and non-binary authors? Because it's the one thing I'd say about the Women's Prize is that, yes, they're open to non-binary and trans authors, but I wouldn't say they're very explicit about it. They nominate authors and then there's uproar, and I can't see on their website that they explicitly mention anything about trans or non-binary authors. So yeah, I just wondered how explicit they were in their support of trans and non-binary authors.
Okay, Stella is extremely explicit, so I'm just looking at their eligibility guidelines. So before, number 1 eligibility says, the Stella Prize is open to books by women and non-binary writers. We do not require any validation regarding an author's gender beyond their self-identification. And then it gets into like novels, where you live, publication, that kind of thing. So they've put it as number 1.
Excellent.
Yeah, and the Carol Shields Prize is pretty much similar. Gender, they say, for women and non-binary writers in every time they mention who's eligible. Yeah. I remember the Women's Prize made a kind of couple false steps when they started the year that they nominated a Kweke Emeze, right? They had some requirement that you had to provide a medical certificate or something, and then was it?
I got the impression with the nomination of a Kweke that they didn't realise that a Kweke is non-binary at the time, and because then it's sort of
maybe that was it. I don't remember.
The nomination happened, and then a lot of people were like, "Oh, great, there's a non-binary writer on the long list," and then they kind of created a flap. And I got the impression that there was but there was a lot of phones ringing off the hook at Women's Prize headquarters, but because I think they try to keep everyone happy, which isn't possible, so they end up sort of making no one happy.
Yeah, which is why I can't find any guidance on their website. I just think, come on, own it. And they won't, which annoys me.
I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but has a trans or non-binary writer been nominated since then for the Women's Prize?
So Tori Peters was nominated last year, was it, for Detransition Baby? But again, that caused furore that I felt like they tripped over a bit. And I don't think a trans or non-binary author has been nominated this year, but I mean, that could just be because they haven't got a book to nominate. But yeah, I don't feel like they are explicit in their support, and I wish they would be. No,
they're definitely not. Yep. And it would probably stop because there's so much back and forth about it. Like when Tori Peters was nominated, it was ridiculous how much like back and forth and conversation there was about it. And if they would just say like, this is the rules of the prize, that's it would probably get rid of a lot of that, because it's this uncertainty that
statement on your website, like the Stella.
Don't invite the conversation, because the Stella hasn't, I mean, it's a much smaller prize, but there's basically no press about that kind of thing, because they're like, these are the rules, it's our prize, that's it.
And it's so important because in this political climate, trans and non-binary folks are the most vulnerable members of society, and they're being, attacked by certain components of the gay community, and a lot of feminists are not. I don't know how I should say a lot, but certainly there's a strand of feminists that are opposed to trans ideologically or whatever, and it's just really never mind what the far right are doing, banning this and banning that. So yeah, it's really important. It's really important.
Yep. Because what's the purpose of these 3 prizes at the end of the day? It's actually not to specifically give prizes to women. It's because in literary circles, cis men are over-amplified. That's the point. So it's a reaction to something that was happening, not because they specifically wanted to really highlight women.
Just following on from this, can I give a shout out to a readathon that's happening on BookTube in April? A trans readathon, Trans Girl April.
Oh, I like that.
I'll email you the announcement videos, but it is sponsored by two trans booktubers, Say Kevy, a recent guest on my Bite-Sized Book Chats. She is fabulous. Oh my God. I'll send you a link to that episode because she is just to die for. And Willow from Books and Bow.
Oh, yes.
Who is quite well known on BookTube and Twitter and I don't know, many places. And I'm really looking forward to that readathon, and I think everybody listening should join in, whether you have any connection to BookTube or not.
That sounds fun. Yeah, we'll put all that in the show notes. That sounds great. All right, cool. Does anyone have any further thoughts? I sure don't. So that's it. I had a thought, Jen, I don't know if you saw that I put this on the schedule, but I think in April for the Patreon episode we might do a bit of an update on how our long list reading is going. So if you want to hear an update.
Okay, yeah.
Jen hasn't. I'm just making this announcement without even warming you up, Jen, at all. So I think if people want to hear about that, that's where they can hear. That's what we'll discuss. I've decided. Because you've said all these things, Jen, so, I'm going to ask you.
All my reservations will come in at once from the library.
Yeah. So you'll be panicking.
Because that's what always happens. Yeah.
Speaking of your Patreon, it should be a nice pot of money there to, buy books from these long lists for people who are guests on your show so that I can read them all. Isn't that how your Patreon works?
That's exactly how it works.
Damn.
If only we made that kind of money from Patreon.
Yeah.
Here you are.
Thank you so much for coming on, Shawn. It was great to have you back on. And thanks for talking through Carol Shields with us.
What a delight. Thank you.
Thank you also, Jen, I suppose.
That's right.
Okay, if you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us with questions, ideas, feedback, whatever. You can at we are the Bookcast Club at outlook.com. You can also contact us on Twitter or Instagram. We are at Bookcast Club on both of those. If you would like to hear more from us, we do have a monthly newsletter. Is it monthly, Jen? Yeah, it's monthly. On that, we have more reviews, new releases, podcast recommendations, updates on the pod, all kinds of stuff. And if you would like even more content from us, we also have a Patreon account, which you can sign up to. And with the Patreons, we have monthly bonus episodes and personalized book recommendations. So thank you so much to Shawn. If you want to hear more from Shawn, as I said, we will put his episode in the show notes. And I will also link his channel and all that kind of stuff. And thank you so much for listening. And we will speak at you again in 2 weeks. Goodbye. Are you guys not going to say goodbye?
Oh, bye.
Oh, goodbye. Goodbye.